All right, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Susan Spaulding. Spaulding. So, Susan earned her undergraduate degree in environmental, population, and organismic biology at CU, and her graduate certificate in geographic information systems at University of Denver. Susan's career as a wildlife biologist started with field studies for federally threatened and endangered species, including desert tortoise, northern spotted owl, and marbled murrelet. Her years of seasonal field work led to a permanent biologist position with the U.S. Forest Service in Lake Tahoe. After several years there, she moved back to her native Colorado, was actually born here, not too many people like that, and into a wildlife program supervisor position with Boulder County Parks and Open Space. Susan more recently moved into a newly created environmental resources specialist position with Parks and Open Space to focus on implementing the Boulder County Comprehensive Plan environmental resources element. A couple tongue twisters here tonight, including collaborative, proactive projects like wildlife crossings that she's going to talk about this evening. I've had a chance to spend field days with Susan when I worked for the U.S. Forest Service locally, and then even more since I retired as a volunteer. And it's been a privilege to be able to spend time with her. And one aspect of Susan that I've really grown to appreciate is her passion and compassion for wildlife, from the largest animals down to the tiny insects. And I have a very recent example of this. Just last week, I was on a field trip, a little site visit with the Parks and Open Space Advisory Committee, and Susan was there. And we were standing around listening to one of the speakers, and I saw what looked like a piece of fuzz just floating in front of my face. And I thought, oh, it's a plant seed, with fuzz on it. And then a little bit later, Susan's holding her hand out, and she says, "There's a fuzzy butted gnat on my palm." And so I went home and I Googled it, and I found this amazing description. I thought some birds had funny names, but fuzzy butted gnat. So Google described it as adult woolly aphids appear as flying lint, tiny drifting angels, or white fuzzies, close to a quarter inch in diameter, which seem to float through the air. So if not for Susan, I would have gone home thinking I saw a little seed floating in front of my face, but I got to find out instead that it was a fuzzy butted gnat. So thank you, Susan, for helping to turn me on to some of the smallest creatures. Please welcome Susan Spaulding.
Buddy, hopefully this is on. Okay. Oh, hold on. Before you do that, let me it's just my computer went to sleep, so let me turn it back on real quick.
Might be good to have that light on so we can see you. Yeah.
Whatever you got. It's kind of blinding a little bit, but I'm sure I could get used to it. Let me just make sure this is gonna. Okay. So. I think it's okay if you guys can see me.
We don't see it on Zoom yet. There it comes. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right. So hi, everyone. Again, my name is Susan Spaulding. Thanks for inviting me here tonight. I'm a wildlife biologist with Boulder County Parks and Open Space. And as Bev said, my title is Environmental Resources Senior Specialist. And just a quick note about my current position. So Boulder County Open Space is supporting my position with the objective of working on bigger picture projects with multiple partners and across jurisdictions. And I'm wondering about the sound. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna back away maybe. Okay, so the concept of my position ties back to the Boulder County Comp Plan, and it.
Unlock your iPhone first.
Oh, Okay.
Sorry,
Sorry, guys. Um. Okay, I'm gonna put my phone away because I didn't know it would talk to me at all. Okay, better? Yes. All right. Okay. So again, my position is called the Environmental Resources Senior Specialist. And just again, a quick note about my position. So Boulder County Open Space is supporting my position with the objective of working on bigger picture projects with multiple partners across jurisdictions. So this concept for this position ties back to the Boulder County Comprehensive Plan and its mission of working across ownership boundaries within the county on behalf of conservation projects. So, and our wildlife crossings project that I'm going to talk about tonight fits right into that description. So it's big and complex with many partners, and we're grateful to be exploring the chances of making it a reality. We appreciate you being here today as public input is super critical in the process. Okay, so here's the general outline of my presentation tonight. Why wildlife crossings are important overall, how problematic is the US 36 corridor and how we know, current efforts by Boulder County, and next steps. And so normally I would take questions after each one of these sections, but I think we've been asked to wait until the end so that everyone on Zoom can hear the answers to the questions. So, okay. So why are wildlife crossings important? So how many of you have seen roadkill? Yeah. How many of you have hit an animal yourselves? Yeah. And how does it make you feel? Right. So now try to put yourselves into the lens of a wild animal. So put yourself in their shoes or paws or hooves. And how do you even understand the concept of a road? The unpredictability of traffic, the noise, the blinding lights, confusing and terrifying. It's terrifying for the animals and for the humans. So clearly roads are very dangerous for our unsuspecting wildlife. So why do they have to cross them? Okay, so many species move on annual migrations, and as we know, these include birds, mammals, amphibians, reptiles, and aquatic species. But basically, movements are all about accessing food, shelter, breeding grounds during different times of the year. So here in Boulder County, we know that our large mobile mammal species such as deer and elk move elevationally to access the resources they need. So for instance, in winter, they need lower elevation areas for less snow depth and warmer temperatures. But other animals also move depending on their home range territories, food resources, etc. So these include species like bears, lions, coyotes, badgers, and smaller animals such as jackrabbits, turtles, bats, snakes, and let's not forget our important insects as well. Okay, so let's talk about roads themselves now. So most people would be surprised to learn that combined distance of paved roads in the US could encircle the Earth more than 160 times. So we have 4.5 million miles of paved surface roads in the US alone. And while these roads and highways make up critical infrastructure, there are significant downsides. So roads fragment habitat by removing habitat directly, but also create barriers to animal movements. So in the cases where roads prevent movement altogether, such as big highways or even smaller roads with a certain number of traffic volume, animal populations become disconnected from each other. So this causes genetic isolation, and it can also lead to inbreeding and ultimately an extinction vortex in some cases. So all of this is very problematic for wildlife. But now let's look at the human costs, and that is, of course, wildlife vehicle collisions. Okay, so on this human side of things, it's estimated that between 1 and 2 million wildlife vehicle collisions with large animals occur in the US every year. And this is as reported by State Farm due to insurance claims, which is trackable. These collisions result in approximately 200 human deaths per year and 30,000 human injuries. So this all costs around $8 billion annually in healthcare costs, lost work days, and property damage. Like think about when you get into any sort of accident, how long it takes to get your car fixed and the impacts on your life in the meantime. Another aspect to consider is how it feels when you're making that split-second decision of whether or not to swerve, not to hit an animal, You're worried about the oncoming traffic, you're worried about cyclists. It's very nerve-wracking. And just to mention here, both of the pictures here are from Boulder County within the last 2 years. Just as an example, people have been sending me their photos since I started this project. Okay, so in the state of Colorado overall, again, according to State Farm, between July 2020 and June 2021, 1 out of every 179 Colorado drivers submitted an insurance claim for damage caused by hitting an animal. So 1 of 179 Colorado drivers. And to remind you, those were the pandemic years, so less driving. So here's another statistic, and that's between 2010 and 2022, there were reported 47,000 wildlife vehicle collisions in Colorado. But again, it's estimated that up to 60% of collisions are not reported because they don't cause property damage to the vehicle. So think of the, imagine the toll we're taking on those unreported instances also. And because I think you're probably wondering, there are 4.3 million drivers in Colorado. All right, so let's talk about our local highway US 36 between Boulder and Lyons. Just how problematic is it and how do we know? So US 36 is a 2-lane highway that runs along the Foothills Plains transition zone in Boulder County. This image shows the very open landscape we have in the corridor in general. And a little more detail on traffic volumes along this corridor. We have between 9,000 and 13,000 vehicle trips per day, depending on where you are between Boulder and Lyons in that corridor. And we know that when traffic reaches 10,000 vehicles a day, it essentially creates a moving fence that's incredibly challenging and deadly for wildlife to navigate, and therefore increases human risks as well. So this slide shows a much bigger perspective on our open landscape. So in Boulder County, we are beyond fortunate to have strong public support for our open space programs, as well as progressive land use codes for unincorporated areas. And Boulder County as a whole contains significant amounts of federal and state public lands as well. So in total, the county boundaries encompass around 80% public land. So Boulder County is 475,000 acres in size, so about 380,000 acres is publicly owned. So we're really special in Boulder County for this. And that's also why we have so much wonderful wildlife in our county. So US 36 is highlighted here in the white dashes to show its location in this open landscape. And again, its placement running right along the Foothills Plains transition zone makes it highly problematic. And I'll explain how we know that. Okay, so the history of the county's awareness of this issue in this corridor includes our Red Hill Elk Management Plan of 2020. So Red Hill is the name of the elk herd that we're going to be talking about today. So we developed this plan collaboratively with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. The plan attempts to address some of the landowner issues occurring in the general area. And this is accomplished by moving elk around the landscape with hunting pressure. And another main issue that we strongly cover in the plan is getting elk safely across US 36 to decrease elk mortalities and increase human safety. So the plan outlines details about wildlife crossings in general and some cost estimates. And of course, this plan went through a lot of public outreach before it was implemented. So the plan states that one main objective is to facilitate highway safety along US 36 by reducing elk vehicle collisions and establishing partnerships with local, state, and federal agencies. Okay, so a little bit more about the Red Hill Elk Plan. As part of the planning process, we worked with CPW to collar several female elk, and that collar data within half a mile of the US 36 corridor and areas east are shown on these maps. So the map on the left shows a heat map of the use areas, and the one on the right shows movements based on collar locations. And you guys see where we are in the corridor here? There's Nelson Road, kind of right in the middle. Niwot Road's at the bottom. St. Vrain's up at the top. So for clarification, each collared elk typically travels with a lot of friends. So we're confident that this data is representing the patterns of many elk. And that's backed up by the repeated ground counts that we conduct with CPW and county staff. So I also want to point out here that our elk travel as far east as diagonal 119. You can see over here, this is Colorado 119. And we've seen an uptick in wildlife vehicle collisions there, unfortunately. And I'll talk about that more later on. Okay, so this is a quick mention of our very own Boulder County Transportation Master Plan, which was updated in 2020. So one metric of analysis they used was animal hits on all roads in the county. Again, you see US 36 as being the most problematic. In fact, between 2009 and 2018, 40% of the total animal hit collisions recorded occurred in this stretch. So this gives you comparative context for the rest of Boulder County. Okay, so a little bit more information on the transportation management plan is that it analyzed many metrics of safety, including, of course, for pedestrians, motorists, and cyclists. And currently, the county is now working towards its Vision Zero plan, which has a goal of 0 human fatalities on the roads by 2035. And I mentioned this in the context of wildlife crossings because decreasing wildlife collisions goes right along with the Vision Zero objectives. And I'll talk about this potential bikeway that's being planned for US 36 to increase cyclist safeties and how it fits into the bigger picture of wildlife crossings in a second too. Okay, so backing up to a state level perspective of US 36, I want to mention that our governor is very focused on wildlife connectivity and as such issued an executive order back in 2019 called Conserving Colorado's Big Game Winter Range and Migration Corridor, declaring the state's commitment to prioritize wildlife habitat connectivity. So Governor Polis also dedicated state funds to use as federal grant matches to assist state and local governments. So out of this elevated interest, the governor established the Colorado Wildlife Transportation Alliance. So this alliance never existed before and was created to facilitate formalized communications between CDOT, so Colorado Department of Transportation, and CPW, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, so related to road projects and the opportunities for wildlife crossings. So this is a screenshot of the CWTA website, which shows 8 high-risk areas, and our US 36 segment is included in those 8. Okay, so another part of the governor's initiative, his emphasis on wildlife connectivity is this study that was completed in April 2022. This was a joint effort by CPW and CDOT, and the report analyzed highways in regions 1, 2, and 4, so basically the eastern half of Colorado. So the report used several data inputs to rank which stretches of highway were the most problematic for human and wildlife safety. The study's rankings are based on consistent modeling inputs, including vehicle collisions as a percentage of the focal species population. So elk, deer, pronghorn, lynx, and bighorn were the species they chose. Migration routes, winter concentration areas, traffic volumes, and speed, both current and predicted, and of course, collision rates overall. So prioritized areas in this study were defined as ranking in the top 5% based on that modeling input and the rankings. So I want to mention how important the release of this report has been because it also provides comprehensive planning tools for managers of land like we are. So a quick reference, these are the CDOT regions that I just mentioned. Again, the Eastern Slope and Plains prioritization study analyzed regions 1, 2, and 4. And just to mention here, the West Slope and Plains study was completed in 2019 for regions 3 and 5, making Colorado one of the only states to have a statewide comprehensive analysis of highways for wildlife issues. So we are pretty far ahead of the game on this one. So this provides decision makers with a larger perspective on priority conflict areas. And by the way, for context, our CDOT Region 4 alone is responsible for 6,500 highway lane miles. So they have their hands full. Okay, so how did we rank in this study? So our stretch between Nelson Road and Hygiene Road is ranked in the top 5%, and in fact scored highest in terms of modeling inputs in all of Region 4. And to be clear, the study does state that all corridors ranked in the top 5% are considered equal in terms of needing safety mitigations, but the ranking of US 36 does fully substantiate and verify the relative importance of mitigations in this corridor. So what does that mean exactly? The data from CDOT and Colorado State Patrol documents that over the last 10 years, there have been 282 reported wildlife vehicle collisions in this corridor. And of those, 120 were deer, 130 were elk, and the rest were bears, lions, and smaller animals. So again, the unfortunate caveat that we've discussed already is that wildlife collisions are up to 60% underreported. So we know wildlife mortality numbers are much higher in our corridor. Yeah, so from the human side of things, luckily, most of these reported crashes resulted in vehicle damage only, with no fatalities reported, but sadly, there were 22 human injuries. Yeah, so it's an impressive stretch. I think we all know. Okay, so here's an overview of the areas specifically called out in that study. You can see Nelson Road and Hygiene Road. So in the report, all the highway segments that ranked in the top 5% were further assessed in person by the study's authors. So they came on the ground and looked at these particular corridors. So these in-person assessments were super high level, but they looked at existing infrastructure such as culverts that could be modified to accommodate underpasses. They also looked at surrounding topography that might support overpasses. So the purple stars on the map show these potential locations. And I overlaid these areas onto our open space and conservation easement data. So when I say open space, county open space, to show land ownership in the corridor. That's important because land ownership is one of the main factors to be considered. You don't want to build an overpass and then have a development happening right at the end of the underpass or overpass. Okay, so here are examples of what those purple stars represent on the ground. Again, these were high-level recommendations by the authors of the study, which serve as a starting point for land managers. And you see here the concrete box culverts and an example of topography that could lend itself to an overpass. Okay, so given everything we know at the local and state levels about the US 36 corridor, what steps are we now taking? So Parks and Open Space contracted with its consulting firms of Benish and Pinion Environmental, who have experience in the realm of wildlife crossings, to develop a conceptual plan for the corridor. Both of these consulting firms are well-versed in using the tools provided by that Eastern Slope and Plains study that I just was talking about. So you can see on this slide a list of what we asked the consultants to consider in the assessment. You'll notice that we asked them to include the potential bikeway along 36 into their analysis. And again, I'll talk more about that in a minute, that bikeway. And also notice that we asked them to include the areas east of US 36 to make sure to incorporate the bigger picture of animal movements in the larger context. Okay, so building on that, I showed this map earlier. This is the area east of US 36 that we're looking at as far as animal movements. In general, when our elk are moving east across the landscape, they cross US 36 and then head through open space and cross Nelson Road. I think if you can track that there and as I speak. And then they cross over Table Mountain, which is Department of Commerce federal land, which is that other blob right there. And then they tend to move along the left-hand creek corridor out to 119. In the past few, again, we have seen an uptick of wildlife crashes on 119 in the last couple of years. And when they travel back west, they generally use this same movement corridor. In any case, we have a really good understanding of these patterns and are considering mitigation measures for Highway 119 and for Nelson Road to make that road more safe as well. So, okay, back to the US 36 corridor itself and our conceptual planning. So these are the spots we analyzed for potential crossings with our consulting firms. So these included all of those high-level recommendations that I just talked about as the purple stars, as well as several others. So these are all either drainage ways, existing culverts, box culverts, or conducive topographical areas. Okay, so here's an example of one of the locations we visited. You can see that US 36 is on the top of that steep slope. And this is a drainage way culvert that could be modified possibly to allow wildlife passage, such as an underpass right here. And here's another location. So these on the ground assessments were done in conjunction with CDOT, CPW, and county staff from Open Space, Transportation, and Public Works. We greatly appreciate our external partner support in this project. So, and just a quick note here, I've mentioned the Diagonal Highway 119, which if you haven't noticed, has a bikeway construction project happening right now, as well as the potential for the bikeway along US 36, and of course the wildlife crossings projects. So these projects are all intertwined in the big picture. So our county departments are working very closely together on all these projects. Okay, so our site visits to these locations helped with further analysis. We analyzed each spot using ranking criteria in a weighted matrix. And I know you can't really see that, but it's just for an example. But the criteria included aspects such as localized wildlife vehicle collision rates and site feasibility, which again included land ownership and land security, and the presence of any unavoidable existing infrastructure. So which areas were identified as priorities? So based on our weighted assessments, the location between St. Vrain Road and Nelson Road is the most problematic and also the most realistic for installation of crossing structures. Plus, based on our elk collar data, it's clearly where the animals cross US 36, mainly the elk, but also deer. This is the heat map of elk collar data, again, that I showed earlier. You see Nelson Road on the south and St. Vrain on the north. And I want to say here that the stats I gave earlier about how many wildlife vehicle collisions occurred along the whole corridor in the past 10 years, well, this is the hot spot with 50% of all of them happening here for deer and elk and other animals. So again, that means that of the 282 reported crashes in this stretch over the past 10 years, 50% of those occurred here within the purple blob on 36. Okay, so this location could be potentially suitable for an overpass or an underpass. So what would that look like in this location? Okay, so here's what an overpass could potentially look like. This is looking north along US 36, and you can just see St. Vrain Road in the distance. And that's our actual topography on the landscape. And please notice the high fencing along the highway that would be a critical part of any wildlife crossing structure. And here you see there's a bikeway shown here. And again, I'll talk about that in a second. Is that? Okay. Okay, so here's what an underpass could look like, again, in this same general area. This is actually the spot I showed you earlier with one of the site visit photos where we had that long distance between the top of the highway and the drainage. So the topography could potentially work here for a structure like this. And again, there's the bikeway incorporated in these renderings. So let's talk about the bikeway. Okay, so the county is currently in the planning stages for a separated bikeway along this US 36 corridor from Boulder to Lyons. The timing of the wildlife crossings and the bikeway is fortunate because we've been able to accommodate each project into the other as far as leaving room in our designs and planning efforts. And I can report that of mid-August, the bikeway feasibility study, which is shown here, is finalized and available on their web address, which is shown on the slide here. So again, these two planning efforts have so far occurred in parallel. And we are now, all of us at Boulder County, referring to the US 36 corridor projects as safety for all, which is catchy and true. Yeah. Okay, and speaking of safety for all, yeah, I want to mention that we're looking at retrofitting existing culverts for smaller animals. We tend to focus on the large animals because they more directly result in human impacts. But with our project, we're planning on incorporate all wildlife. So other crossing projects in North America have documented species such as garter snakes, painted turtles, marmots, boreal toads, badgers, and even beavers using them. So this will be our goal as well. And not to mention also that we have the federally listed Preble's Meadow jumping mouse in the corridor. So maybe we can help even the littlest of animals. Okay, so let's talk about costs. Here are the estimates from the study we just completed. And these are adjusted for a 3-year inflation bump. And they include the extra cost of incorporating of a potential future bikeway. Okay, so also listed here is the wildlife fencing, which again is integral. The fencing keeps the wildlife off the road and directs them to the crossing structures. And for the smaller animals, we estimated cost to, again, retrofit existing culverts, such as the box culverts or drainage culverts. And of course, any structures we build for large animals will also accommodate smaller animals, as there are ways to entice the smaller animals to use them, such as brush piles or some sort of overhead cover at smaller scales that you build into those larger structures. So basically, this is a menu of how much money we might need, which gives us the information to make decisions about our next steps. Okay, so what are our next steps? So we need to continuously reach out to landowners and the public about this project. We want ideas and input as we move along. And we know we need long-term support because again, this is a large, complex, expensive project. We also need to work very closely with CPW as they manage the wildlife in our state. And CDOT, of course, manages the roads themselves, and they have a lot of issues to contend with. But both of these agencies do support Boulder County moving forward with seeking funds to do a more in-depth planning, designs and planning. And as such, Boulder County is planning to apply for a federal planning grant in May 2025, which is allocated at the federal level specifically to wildlife crossings nationwide. So there's a pool of money that the Biden administration has allocated for wildlife crossings nationwide. It's part of the Inflation Reduction Act bill, and it's called the Wildlife Crossings Pilot Program. And there's $350 million allocated. And this would be the third year of that $350 million being given out. But that's a drop in the bucket, let's be honest, for everything that needs to happen out there. But again, it's amazing that it was considered in the first place. So again, we have a long ways to go. It'll require a lot of coordination with partner agencies and the public. Again, without public support for projects of this magnitude, they simply won't happen. Okay, so along those lines, here's our website address. If you haven't done so already, please take the survey at our site and provide comments. The website also includes an email sign up for any updates on the project. It also provides information on what we've done so far, including sending out 800 landowner letters to the project, inviting them to an open house that we hosted in August to get their input and concerns. And that meeting is recorded on this website as well. And of course, we encourage these landowners to take our surveys. And let me tell you about our public support so far. We're very grateful to the more than 500 members of the public who've taken the survey. And of these respondents, 95.5% strongly support the project. So that's really encouraging. And comments have included a lot of personal examples of narrowly avoiding or actually hitting wildlife in this exact corridor. So we please encourage you to share your comments and thoughts so we can capture them officially as we move forward. And it really helps our partner agencies to hear this feedback as well. Okay, our website now has our study that I've been referring to tonight, the US 36 Wildlife Crossings Assessment, Prioritization, and Cost Estimation Study. It's now posted on our website. It was finalized at the end of August and provides us with the conceptual baseline that I've been discussing. So again, lots more details. So I encourage you to look at the report. Okay, our site also has links to information about wildlife crossings in general, including a great webinar on other crossings projects in the state given by Julia Kinch. She's a true road ecologist who is one of the main researchers who conducted that Eastern Slope and Plains wildlife study that was so integral for us to move forward. The webinar also includes Ben Goldfarb, who's the author of the book Crossings, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. He's an amazing ambassador on this subject. And at the end of this webinar, I was also invited to give an overview of our US 36 crossings projects. And we also just posted a link that I found really recently to reporting by Channel 7 that's also a great overview of what's going on in the state overall for wildlife crossings. Okay, and with that, thanks again. My contact information is listed here if you want to reach out at any point, at any time. And now I can answer any questions.
Getting the lights on. Questions in the room, please. Wait for me to bring the mic. Can you hear me? It's not. No. The light on it. Oh, I think it's battery. Okay. Michael.
We're not hearing the mic anymore.
You want to use this one?
Yeah, better.
Okay, I can't get this on.
Hello, hello.
Can we dim the lights at all?
Okay.
Awesome.
Sandra, we had a microphone issue. We have a replacement now. So questions in the room. We'll go here and then.
How do the large animals get funneled onto the crossings? Or
Yeah. so-
I did read crossings, and
Yeah.
it sounds like they can gravitate along the fences.
Exactly. The fences are strategically placed to move them to where you want them to cross. So
Mhm.
they'll just investigate the fencing until they find a place to cross.
Where do they spend the winter? This particular herd.
The Red Hill herd,
Uh-huh.
they spend the winter down here on
I
mainly.
meant the summer, actually.
Oh, summer.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they're bounded in the north by Highway 7, so South St. Vrain corridor, and bounded on the south by the Left Hand Creek corridor. So if you can imagine, they move up with those two sort of bounding sides. So up into Indian Peaks, Brainerd area. Yeah. Yeah. And then I want to mention too that we have a resident herd that sticks around year round, and that's about 100 animals. And they live on Table Mountain, the Department of Commerce complex, and then also our open space properties, and then Heil, so kind of the east side of Heil Valley Ranch. And so we've got those guys that are hanging out all year. So they're kind of crossing all the time. And our migratory segment comes back down about now, and that's about 400 animals. So total, we have about 550 in the winter.
Okay, we have another question in the room and then we'll go to Zoom.
This all sounds like really good stuff that's happening, and I think that's real exciting. It's just kind of on a more basic level. It has always struck me that the speed limit along 36 is crazy, given all the animals and all the traffic and the bikers. And does anybody ever talk about reducing the speed limit to 45 or 55 miles an hour, which would seem a lot safer?
Yeah, definitely that's coming up in conversations. People tend to ignore speed limits, right? But CPW tried to reduce the speed limit to 55. This was back in, I think, 2015 through 2018. There were nighttime speed limits of 55, and they were posted all along the corridor. And it was to try to see if people would actually pay attention and it would help. But unfortunately, they ignored it pretty quickly. So
I do agree that people ignore the speed limit, but it seems to me that whatever it is, people will drive maybe 10 miles over. So if it was lower,
put it
maybe
down to like
they'd at
20.
least be driving
Yeah.
a few miles per hour.
Yeah, I hear you. I think that's a great idea. And those are conversations we can continue having with CDOT as well, for sure. Because you're right, people drive very, very fast.
Sandra, do we have a Zoom question or two? And then
We
we'll come.
do. Maggie, would you like to unmute and ask yours?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, I'm really curious about what kind of wildlife collisions are being reported other than deer and other than elk, because it really amazes me that people report those at all. So in terms of those small animals like birds and reptiles and amphibians, what are people reporting that they're hitting and where, if you know off top?
Yeah, so it's not necessarily that people report them, but Colorado State Patrol and CPW, they will pick up either the carcasses or they'll make note of the other species. So anything we know about those smaller species typically comes from those agencies that keep track. Yeah, so there's prairie dogs and jackrabbits and snakes, unfortunately. We've had badgers hit along that corridor, which is very sad because badgers are declining in the county. What's that? Oh yeah, there was a ringtail cat. Yeah, which is also, those guys are expanding their range and they're showing up in Boulder County, but they're pretty small numbers. But yeah, that's true. Oh, we've had beavers. Ugh. Yeah, it's not great.
Sandra, anybody else on Zoom?
We do have several. Kathy, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, I think my question was kind of answered, but I'm just curious, is there a corridor that these elk and deer come down? You said, I think you mentioned they come down from Indian Peaks. I'm wondering if also from Rocky Mountain National Park or other places?
Yeah, so Rocky Mountain National Park, the Estes herd, they're pretty much kind of, they don't really intermingle with the Red Hill herd that we know of too much. Because again, there's those geographical barriers. Yeah, so they're not part of the equation, Estes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so these are coming, are the ones that are coming across 36 are coming, you said, from Indian Peaks mostly?
Yes, yep.
Okay,
And there's
thank
some
you.
idea,
Yeah.
there's some speculation that they might come from Rabbit Mountain as well. But not very often. We've tried to sort of document that, but we can't really find evidence of it. Like the collar data didn't tell us that. Because Highway 66 is a big barrier to movement as well.
Mm.
So
Do we have another question in the room?
Susan, I was wondering, how often does the resident herd move across Highway 36? Is it daily? Is it weekly?
that's a great question.
Monthly? I mean,
Well, we do, I can answer that question because we do ground counts. CPW and county staff do ground counts to try to keep track of the resident herd. During calving, they're mostly hanging out in the riparian corridors, like on our Lucanen property, which is east of 36. And then a lot of time though, they'll hang out on Heil for days at a time. So I can't really answer that question, but it's not infrequently. Yeah, they use that whole area for sure.
I think I saw another hand raised back here.
Do most wildlife prefer the overpasses, and are there some that prefer underpasses?
Yeah, it's a great question. A lot of species will use underpasses if they're big enough. A lot of the smaller animals will happily use underpasses. Deer will use underpasses, but elk and underpass is a little more complicated. They will use it if it's at least 15 feet high and it's got to be pretty wide. They're not accustomed to going underneath things, so they're the tricky ones. But they have been shown to use it. And then pronghorn do not like underpasses very well. And I guess there are instances where they will use them, but they really prefer overpasses. And elk prefer overpasses. Yeah, so it does depend.
I had an incident with a group that was out looking at wildflowers, and I think it was in the vicinity of Nelson Road off 36. And we came into a little cluster on the east side of bushes and trees, and there were at least 3 or more elk carcasses rotting there. And it was kind of startling. And I was wondering if they might have been injured on the road and staggered down and collapsed in the cool foliage. Or what does the state do when they have carcasses on the road?
Well, that's a good question. Sometimes they will just push them to the side of the road. Sometimes they take them away. Good question. I think your speculation might be right that they were hit on the road and then they staggered in there.
Yeah, it was either that or some kind of poaching. We said, no, it's probably not poaching,
Oh,
but.
yeah. Well, and what kind of gets me is when something like that happens, no one's going to see those carcasses, and so they're not.
Wildlands. We stumbled on them.
Yeah, they're not counted exactly, and a lot of animals will get hit and run off half a mile and die. So, unfortunately, yeah.
Sandra, do we have some more Zoom questions?
Yes, we do. Bill's got a question related to the question about over versus under, the animal's preferences. Bill's got a different version. Go ahead and unmic and ask your question, Bill. I'm not seeing Bill respond, so I will ask if, so the animals have some preferences for overpass or underpass. Do you have preferences?
That's a good question. My preference is for whatever can be built realistically and what will accommodate most species of animals. So if we can build an underpass that's tall enough and wide enough for elk, let's go for it. It's less expensive, as you guys saw in the cost estimates, and it can be as effective. In fact, one of the stats I pulled off about Colorado in general, right now there are 40 underpasses for elk, I'm sorry, for animals in general, and 3 overpasses. So that kind of tells you how much more complicated it is to get an overpass. Sometimes overpasses are the thing that's needed 100%, but I'm coming around to thinking that underpasses might be the most realistic option for our corridor. And I would want to do several along the whole stretch, some big, some small, but enough so that all the animals can find one within a reasonable distance of when they're searching for a way to get across the road.
Thank you. Trish also has a question.
Hi, yes, I wanted to know if there's a certain season or time of day where there's the most activity on 36 for crossings.
Absolutely. So I just mentioned our migratory segment that comes back to the lower elevations, and that's right about now. So we're seeing an influx of about 450 animals, and that's now because it's their breeding season and it's getting cold. So they come down for the breeding and for the resources that are available to them at lower elevations. So now, and then dawn and dusk is typically when you see them
Yeah.
crossing roads, and I'm talking elk mainly. Deer tend to cross at dusk, and they're a little more kind of scattered along the corridor, but they do definitely like the area that the elk like as well. So anytime you're near St. Vrain Road and Nelson Road on that corridor, be super duper careful.
Mm.
Um,
The other
I think
question I
another
had,
question.
oh, go ahead.
2 in the room. Do you have your hand raised?
I just wanted to comment that I read Crossings this summer, and I would highly recommend that everyone in the room seek it out. The library has it. I would also recommend the webinar that Susan mentioned. Really, really, really informative. This is something that anyone who cares about wildlife should look into. It'll really open your eyes and startle you.
And it's out in paperback now too.
mhm.
We've got another question in the room, Sandra, then back to you.
I would second the reading of the crossings too. Our book club read it last year and it's outstanding. Is there evidence that the elk and the deer learn where the crossings are and they just naturally go to it after a while?
They do, yeah. There's kind of along those lines. So Banff National Park up in Canada, they were the instigators of wildlife crossings. They really are the international example, and they've been monitoring what species will use them, when they'll find them, how they kind of have this generational knowledge that they pass down. And they have, for instance, grizzly bears now use the overpasses 35 times more frequently than they did when they were first built. So they find them, they learn, and they use them. Yeah. So, and there's some examples of how elk might watch the deer go through an underpass and then follow them. That's also been documented. So like, hey, what are you doing? Can I fit in there too? Yeah.
Sandra, do you have some more Zoom questions?
I have one, which is the list of those priority crossing segments of highways on the governor's page or the state alliance page. Also had the road to the other end of our town here in Boulder, Highway 93. What thoughts, what do you know about what might be happening down there and what agencies would be involved in that?
Yeah, great question. I'll tell you what I do know. So Rocky Flats Wildlife Refuge, they have funded their own sort of add-on to the Eastern Slope and Plains Wildlife Prioritization Study that the state did. So they asked for a different consulting group to do a conceptual design for the areas around the refuge, right? So that's Highway 93 and Highway 128 and Indiana and Highway 72. So that what they have right now is a high level conceptual plan. And we actually, Boulder County, joined them as co-applicants for those federal funds I mentioned earlier, to do a more in-depth design and analysis of Highway 128 specifically, to try to get their elk, and they have about 400 across Highway 128 to Boulder County's open space property, which Boulder County and City of Boulder property, which is contiguous about 7,000 acres, and that's north of Highway 128. And then Rocky Flats itself is about 7,000 acres. So that's 14,000 acres that would be connected with an underpass under 128. And so we provided letters of support. We were co-applicants, and then City of Boulder provided a letter of support. We're also really interested in that underpass under 128 because it's along Rock Creek. The drainage way is called Rock Creek, and there have historically been Preble's Meadow jumping mouse on Rock Creek, and we want to be able to facilitate their movement over 128 and also northern leopard frog. So that's why we joined as a co-applicant. We're really hoping that they get some traction on that grant funding. So that's what I know. Yeah, a little bit.
Anybody else on Zoom? And then I'll ask in the room one more time.
We do have one more on Zoom. Rose, would you like to ask your question? Unmute. I'll ask it for her. Oh, no, here she is. Go ahead, Rose. We are not hearing you. Can you use sensors, she asked, to detect animals that can transmit warnings to approaching traffic?
Yeah, so that's kind of emerging technology that does exist and is being tried in certain areas, like up near Craig, Colorado. There's like a radar detector that's it's heat sensing, so it can kind of detect when animals are coming, and then flashing lights happen. So again, the cars would slow down, you would hope. They're having a little problem with it, like vegetation that waves, or animals that kind of camp out, like they might come up to the road and then just sit there. That messes up the radar. Yeah. But so I mentioned that our movement, that when our animals cross Nelson Road, so please be careful on Nelson Road. Also, you guys, when they cross Nelson Road and they go to Table Mountain, the whole big Table Mountain facility, we're thinking of maybe something like that on Nelson Road. We don't think that an overpass or underpass is realistic there. So what are some other ideas that we could implement, like sensors and radar? So that's an idea we're exploring. Yeah, good question.
Last call for Zoom questions.
I don't see any more.
Anybody else in the room? We have another one in the room.
Susan, if this project gets through the approval process and gets the funding, when would you expect it would be implemented?
Good question. So right now we're planning on going for like a more in-depth planning grant in May of 2025. And those funds would be allocated in like the year after. And so we'd start kind of working towards that. And then once you have like, say, 80% designs for the corridor, then you can start looking for implementation funding. And I don't know if you guys put those numbers together, and I didn't really talk about it in depth, but I mean, we're talking at least $40 million, depending on what we do, but that's kind of the minimum. So you'll see in the report that's posted online is that we have kind of a phased approach that we're sort of looking at. The first phase would be like 40 million, and then it goes up from there. So yeah, these are really expensive projects, and we got to work really closely with CDOT and CPW, anyone in the state. We got to set up maybe a public donation platform that we could kind of pick away at some of this to show those other agencies that our public is very interested in. They're, willing to donate that kind of thing. I mean, I'm not thinking we can raise $40 million, but wouldn't that be nice? So long-term, it's super long-term. I don't even want to put a time frame on it, but we're rolling. These are the first important steps. We're raising awareness. We've got a conceptual design for the corridor. We've got a potential funding source that's coming up next year to do more work. The commissioners very much support this project. This is actually, I meant to say, these are the commissioners. We took a site visit with them. Very supportive. So they can allocate money in budgets, possibly the county budgets, to do further planning as well if we don't get the federal grant. So yeah, there's lots of avenues that we can keep investigating. Yeah.
All right, last call for questions in the room. Thank you, Susan. That was amazing. And thanks everybody for your great questions.
Thank you.